Your first planted tank. This can feel like a really big jump from a normal aquarium. This is part 2 of a little mini series I'm doing where I give you guys 5 tips to make your first planted tank a success. Hey, what is up guys? Kalem or Kalem's Fish Tanks, and in today's video, we've got another 5 tips for your first successful planted tank. If you haven't checked out part 1, I'd recommend doing it. I'll put a link up there, because you definitely don't want to miss out on those tips either. But without further ado, let's jump right into this. So tip number 1 is consistency. Consistency is so important in planted tanks, and there's a bunch of things we can do to keep our planted tanks consistent. Some important things that new aquarists skip over are things like timers. Timers will be your best friend with a planted tank, especially timers on your lights. You want to make sure your light goes on and off at the same time every day. This will allow your plants to get in a cycle and they'll know what's coming, and this will just help you get better growth and keep happier plants. It'll be good for your fish as well. Consistency also applies to your maintenance. It's really helpful to do weekly maintenance on your tank, whether that's a 20, 30, 40, or 50% water change. You want to keep consistent with this and do it every week around the same day. I mean, if you're not perfect, it'll be okay, but you want to keep things pretty consistent. The same applies for fertilizer, which we'll talk a little bit about later on. But if you're fertilizing, you want to keep consistent and follow your dosing schedule. If your tank is doing well, don't change things up. Things are working for a reason and you want to keep it consistent. If things are going bad though, don't make huge changes. Don't go in and change 8 different things at once or do huge changes. You want to keep your tank relatively consistent because plants really appreciate consistency, and it's best for them if you want to get lush and beautiful growth. Tip number 2 kind of goes hand in hand with the subject of maintenance, and that is learning how to do proper maintenance. In a normal fish tank, you don't have plants everywhere, so you can easily gravel vacuum all that excess detritus, fish waste, fish poop, all that stuff out of your substrate. But in a planted aquarium, you can't. A lot of people think that, oh, the plants will use this all up and it'll be like extra fertilizer. But after a while, this can really start adding up and will cause some bad problems like black-beard algae. So you need to learn how to do proper maintenance to deal with this to prevent those nasty algae. Now, I'll post another video with a link up here if you want to go learn how to do proper maintenance, but this doesn't have to be done all the time. I do it about once a month, and older tanks I try to do it a little bit more often. But this is something that will be a bit useful a bit later on in your aquarium hobby, especially if you start getting black-beard algae. So tip number 3 is a really important one, and I find a lot of people messing this up. And tip number 3 is knowing when to fertilize. Fertilizers are a really tough topic for a lot of new aquarists. I would say about 80% of low-tech tanks won't need any fertilizer at all, but people still use it. They read online that fertilizer will help speed up their plant growth, so they start adding a ton, and this will cause a lot more problems than good. Now, I'm mainly talking about liquid fertilizers. People will pump these into their tanks every single week, hoping it'll make their plants grow faster, but usually the only thing that grows faster is the algae. If you're new and you're starting a low-tech tank, I would recommend using a nutrient-rich substrate as well as root tabs, which will really help you out a lot. Don't use fertilizer unless you don't need to. If your plants are showing signs like they would need fertilizer, so things like yellowing or deformed growth, that kind of thing, then yeah, I would definitely start adding a bit. But if they're growing normally, I wouldn't start pumping a bunch in. Chances are you'll just get algae. In most tanks, your fish will provide a lot of nutrients for your plants through their waste, and you don't really need any fertilizers. Fertilization is kind of a hard topic to cover in a short amount of time, so if you guys want an in-depth tutorial on fertilizer later on, let me know down below in the comments. Now, if you've liked the video so far, make sure to drop a like and subscribe down below to help out a small content creator like me. It would really be appreciated. But now let's move on to tip number 4. So tip number 4 is to start small. Typically when starting in aquariums, everyone suggests to get as big of a tank as possible, and there's a couple reasons for this. First off, it's going to take less maintenance, and it's going to be more stable and easier to maintain. But with planted tanks, it's a little bit different. It's going to have those cons. If it's small, it's going to be less stable and you're going to need more frequent maintenance, but the pros, I think, heavily outweigh these cons. The big pro of a smaller planted tank is the cost. You're going to cut less corners, and you're going to, hopefully after this video, get the right equipment to set yourself up for success. The bigger the tank gets for planted tanks, the cost really starts to add up. Setting up a small tank like a 7.5 or a 10 gallon and setting it up properly isn't too expensive. With a low-tech tank, what's going to determine how well your plants grow are your lights and your substrate. These are the two things that can start adding up the most in a bigger tank. You know, with a small tank, you may only need one bag of that expensive substrate, and that's not too bad, but the big area where things add up is the light. What I've found is with small tanks like these, pretty much any light should work pretty well for a low-tech tank. You can even use things like desk lamps, but the bigger tank you go, or the bigger the tank you get, it's really going to start adding up, and it's going to be pretty expensive to light that thing well to where all areas of the tank can grow plants well. Also, the higher the tank is, the more difficult it is going to be to get light down to the bottom. That's why I recommend starting with these smaller tanks, because it'll allow you to try more species and hopefully have more success. So my final tip number 5, is to get familiar with different kinds of algae. Just like people do with fish illnesses before they start getting fish, you want to be prepared for these algae before you start getting them. To do this, I'm not going to go into all the different kinds of algae, but I will put down some links below on good resources I've found that I think would really help you guys with algae in the future. But anyways guys, I think that about wraps it up. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, make sure to drop a like down below. But anyways, this was Kalem's Fish Tanks. Thank you so much for watching. Peace.